stops with me.
Henry Kissinger said, "To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous. To be a friend of the United States is fatal."
Nằm xuống đi. Nè đi. Nằm xuống.
Trời ơi, tôi cứu mấy ông Tây mà tôi ấy.
Well, I thought had somebody opened up, or some group opened up with a light machine gun. You could, of course, the driver was hit with almost the first burst. I could feel his blood coming onto my hands. But he's a terrific chap, and he kept going, and that's what saved us. If he'd stopped, we'd have been finished. And I remember one great shock, and I thought we'd been hit by a heavier weapon. The blood was pouring down from the driver. I was amazed that he could keep going.
These plans to house nuclear-capable aircraft in the top end have not been announced and were only uncovered by Four Corners in US tender documents. The documents show the US Defence Department is planning to build an aircraft parking apron to accommodate 6 B-52s at Tyndall. In addition, there are detailed designs for the construction of a United States Air Force Squadron Operations Facility and Maintenance Centre at the base. These are to support deployed B-52 squadrons. The US Air Force is also building its own fuel storage tanks and a bunker for ammunition.
Will US nuclear missiles to arm those B-52s be stored here too, at Tyndall? It was America's B-52 bombers which did horrendous damage during the Vietnam War to the civilian population. This is Neil Davis, an Australian news cameraman who covered the Vietnam War for 11 long years. Neil became a legend during the war for his courage and humanity, and how his footage depicted the true nature of war.
I was afraid of the B-52s, the 8-engine bomber used by the Americans. The B-52s carried 30 tons of bombs each. They needed 3 semi-trailers to load one of these bombers, and they flew in an arrow formation, an inverted V if you like, and dropped their bombs, 90 tons in all, simultaneously, usually from a height where they couldn't be seen, nor could they be heard, so that the first thing the Viet Cong knew on the ground was that they were being obliterated. High explosive bombs meant to shatter deep bunkers, and they were killed either directly on top of the ground or indirectly below when the shock waves surged through those deep bunkers, and they were killed in that way. There were phosphorus bombs included in the load, which set fire to everything on top of the ground. That resulted in them, of course, being denied oxygen down below because of fire burning up the oxygen. So it was pretty devastating. I didn't want to be caught in anything like that when I went with the Viet Cong.
As the wind blows, it's just 2 hours flight from Darwin to Alice Springs, and another 27 kilometres drive to Pine Gap, the US military's top secret spy base.
Pine Gap has one very important role in the event of American nuclear war, which is to indicate what are potential targets for an American second strike on China. The infrared satellites that downlink through Pine Gap and through bases in Britain and the United States, but through Pine Gap for our part of the world, they register. They're infrared telescopes basically in space. They register the enormous but very brief heat plume of the launch of a ballistic missile. And the technology is now at the stage from the launch of the missile for about 10-12 seconds following that heat bloom before it burns out and enters upper levels of the atmosphere and space. The facilities at Pine Gap and what it is connected to in terms of American sensor technology can compute the location of the launch, the time, absolutely the precise time of the launch, the trajectory, which can be calculated from projecting from its initial trajectory, and can then inform the American and Japanese missile defence facilities on land and at sea, particularly those at sea, that if those interceptor missiles are then pointed at a particular part of the sky, not the whole sky, but just a very particular part, then their radars have a chance of picking up the incoming Chinese missile and destroying them. That means if it works as advertised, and there's a lot of doubt about whether it will, but if it does, for China, that means that suddenly their nuclear deterrent capability is either vitiated or even eliminated almost completely. So China is immensely vulnerable to that, and the Chinese are well aware of that.
Pine Gap is absolutely key to the command and control of United States forces in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And Pine Gap, in fact, covers most of the territory of Russia as well.
There's the idea, certainly the Australian governments have talked about publicly since the 1990s, that extended nuclear deterrence, the American nuclear umbrella over Australia, is a shield which will protect us against any nuclear threats. The only problem about that is the United States has not ever said so publicly. There is no written public commitment from the United States.
Missile attacks on Australian naval and air bases would be on the cards.
Would Pine Gap be targeted?
I think it's almost inevitable that Pine Gap would be targeted.
Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert when danger threatened him.
This is a US government film made in 1951 to help Americans deal with the reality if an atomic bomb hit their town or city.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
In the case of China, those 1,800 deployed weapons that the Americans have and another 3,000 or so in the locker ready to go are an order of magnitude bigger than what China has, which is about 350, perhaps 400, something like that. Now, it's not a matter of a seesaw, 400 one side, 1800 on the other. It's also the fact that the Americans have vastly more sophisticated systems for targeting, for missile defence. Chinese fire their missiles. American missile defence shield will stop a certain number of those, probably a lot. We don't really know.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by.
This is not just a matter of deterrence. If the Chinese fire several hundred missiles at America, it will be catastrophic for the Americans. But after that, they won't be able to do anything, even if they get through, and not many will get through, because the Americans have the capacity to target Chinese missiles. They can conduct nuclear warfighting operations, because what Pine Gap, for example, helps them to do.
Duck and cover.
If Russia, for example, wanted to send a signal to the United States, using nuclear weapons as signalling sound is horrific and awful, but it's certainly part of the plan. And if it wanted to say to the United States, don't go any further, we are really serious about this. One way in which that could be done technically and possibly politically quite effectively from the Russian point of view wouldn't to be use a small or a single nuclear attack on a target that the Americans think is important. To do that, they wouldn't want to do something which is so important as to provoke a huge American attack. They certainly wouldn't want to target an American city. One of the most obvious signalling operations that's been considered by Australian nuclear planners, not that we've ever done anything about it, is that Pine Gap would be a very good signalling target with the virtue of destroying part of an American capability, nowhere near a major population centre, an American ally, but not America. Any nuclear attack on Pine Gap, of course, would destroy the facility, but the fire and blast effects on Alice Springs would be horrific.
10 seconds to go. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The mighty power of the atom is unleashed.
We know from the Maralinga and Emu field tests the British conducted in the 1950s that Central Australian and South Australian tests can, under certain circumstances, distribute fallout to Adelaide, Brisbane and other Australian cities.
We must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn. But the most important thing of all is to duck and cover yourself, especially where your clothes do not cover you.
If anything happens to start the nuclear ball rolling, A, it's going to be unstoppable, and B, it's going to be horrific every way round. The most effective way of destroying a base like Pine Gap is not to have a bomb which explodes on the ground, but one that explodes about 500 or 600 metres up. If you think about the pressure as a sphere, you want to optimise the effect in a particular area. This is a horrific way of thinking about part of our country, but it's what's likely to be an airburst rather than a ground burst. Fallout depends on two factors. One is which way is the wind blowing, which depends on the day and the climate at the time. The second is the height of a burst. fallout, which is not radiation from the bomb itself, but irradiated earth materials when the fireball touches the ground and is then lofted up into the sky and then blown somewhere.
Hospitals in the Northern Territory are being overwhelmed by patients, with both facilities in the capital Darwin operating under a code yellow. The emergency management response allows for services to be shut down and patients transferred from Darwin to regional centres.
Breathing life into a struggling health system. It's hoped these graduate nurses will boost staffing levels in a system overwhelmed.
If you ever fly into Alice Springs and look out the window, you're very likely to see Pine Gap in the distance. And not only is there a large airport south of Alice Springs now, with perhaps 1,000 people there at any one time, there is also a very large and overcrowded prison with more than 800 inmates at any one time and a comparable number of staff. The housing parts of Alice Springs have expanded towards Pine Gap. So it's the first responsibility of an Australian government is to think about the well-being of Australians, the security of Australians. And so very basic questions about civil defence, about the defensibility of Pine Gap, and it's not defensible, and the value to Australians has to consider the well-being of the people of Alice Springs and the region around it.
There an attack, for instance, on Pine Gap, Alice Springs. It would be a hard call for the AMA and for the federal government, state territories, to send nurses and doctors into that contaminated situation.
Yes, exactly. When you've got a radioactive, virtually a radioactive wasteland, who's going to want to go there to help out any survivors? But in addition to that, we look at what all the things that health services need to operate. They need communications, transport, clean water, sewage, etc., etc. All their supplies, all of the things which would be virtually destroyed in the event of a nuclear war. So that's it's one of the overwhelming reasons why we say that health services would have very little to offer in the event of a nuclear war. And that was the experience at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The remaining health services there, which were very few, were overwhelmed, and they were reduced to little more than first aid stations, dabbing of wounds and that sort of thing. And that...
Watching people die.
Well, exactly, yeah, exactly, and having very little to ease that death. So that's what would be facing us again in the event of a nuclear war again, except almost certainly on a much, much larger scale than was seen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, everything one talks about in relation to nuclear weapons is horrific, but nuclear famine, the studies here indicate that in the event of a nuclear war involving only a fraction of the nuclear weapons that exist in the world today, and most of them belong to either the US or Russia, in the event of a nuclear war with just a fraction of the weapons that those countries have, the amount of soot and other particulate matter drawn up into the atmosphere would be so great that there'd be blocking of sunlight, reduction of rainfall, agricultural impacts on the world's main food crops, rice, corn, soy, wheat, with the result being global famine, affecting possibly up to 2 billion people.
When the Prime Minister sits in his chair, and when the Foreign Minister sits in her chair, and when the Defence Minister sits in his chair, they speak for the country. Polls show that notwithstanding our concerns or grievances, Australian people do not want to be involved in a conflict between the United States and China. Young people in particular want this country to remain neutral.
The possibility of existential threat from nuclear war is very real, and the more casually it's talked about, the more it is normalised. And that's the first danger. The second existential threat is clearly climate change, and we are just beginning to see the effects of that, or rather in rich countries we're just beginning to see the effects of that. And we have had this diabolically stupid, and I would say frankly criminal, level of climate denialism plaguing the Australian political system for not just a decade, for much, much longer than that.
A sunburnt country that's bearing the brunt of more and more natural disasters, from the Black Summer bushfires, relentless drought, and unprecedented flooding events. Now the State of Environment report painting a bleak picture.
It is a sobering read. In general, most of our environments are in a poor state, and critically, their trajectory is poor as well.
Today, the new Environment Minister sharing that news gathered across the past 5 years.
A difficult, confronting and sometimes depressing story.
Describing the state of the environment as poor and deteriorating. Land temperatures have risen by 1.4 degrees since consistent records began. The nation's biodiversity decimated. Australia has lost more mammal species than any other continent, warning at least 19 ecosystems are on the brink of collapse. Since 2016, some 202 fauna and flora species have been listed as threatened.
The environmental crisis and the biodiversity crisis have been rolling out for some time now, and we really have run out of time.
But not budging on the 2030 emissions reduction target.
On the 43% target, we made a promise to the Australian people. We're going to keep the promise.
Does what this report show you not give you enough of a message to say perhaps we need to reassess this target?
I think this report would give anyone who reads it a very strong message that we need to do better on the environment. We're only going to have one go at this.
If we do not either get very serious regulation of nuclear weapons, or we're on the path to their abolition, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a first step, or very serious restriction of the numbers and functions of nuclear weapons in ways we haven't ever seen, then we are going to be entering a world of global conflict over climate with nuclear weapons.
We will have two great powers that are nuclear armed going head to head. We must have the contest dying down. We must stop egging the United States on. If we don't cooperate, we're finished. That's the long and the short of it. We're finished.
Pacific delegates attended the historic two-day summit in Washington, agreeing climate change is the region's highest priority. The US has pledged to invest more than $860 million in the Pacific.
The security of America, quite frankly, and the world depends on your security and the security of the Pacific Islands, and I really mean that.
Analysts say the deal is a way for the US to counter China's influence in the Pacific after Beijing signed a security pact with Solomon Islands earlier this year.
The whole thing about the South Pacific, for example, what worries them immensely is climate change. And we're going up there filling their ear about, oh, you must be worried about China, you've got to be worried about China. And then all this stuff about, oh, China wants to have a military base there or a naval base there. It is of no military interest. That would be of no military interest to it. It can't protect the supply lines that's so far away from China. The Americans have got several bases in other islands up there, and they, and planes as well as submarines and everything, they could destroy any base that the Chinese put in very, very quickly. But we're determined to keep trying to leak that they could be used as a base.
Well, the nuclear submarines is just a symptom of this whole ongoing problem of our alliance with the United States and more or less doing whatever is in the perceived to be in the United States' interest. And yes, indeed, Australia's neighbours, especially Indonesia, are deeply concerned about the prospect of nuclear submarines for Australia and the possibility of an arms race within our region. And they're concerned for very good reason, because the nuclear submarines are highly destabilising, provocative, and they are a very significant nuclear weapons proliferation risk.
It's designed to counter China, but Indonesia doesn't like the idea of nuclear-powered submarines patrolling its neighbourhood.
The central pillar of Australian security remains its alliance with the United States.
The AUKUS arrangements with our allies in the United States and the UK will serve the interests of our three nations.
Thinking about what is the best option for Australia, we are very mindful that it would be advantageous to be operating a submarine which is being operated elsewhere as well.
It's all very well to say that the United States reinforcement of Australia's defence capability enhances our sovereignty, but that is only if Australia actually retains truly effective and independent command of Australian armed forces.
If you're going to have anything approaching a individual defence, independent is a better way to put it, defence policy or foreign policy, you must be able to keep your equipment separate. You can't do all your training based on the idea that all the forces are integrated, etc. It's too late at the day that the war's about to start, say, no, we don't want to be in it. You've got to say from the beginning, we will not engage in any wars of aggression, because that's against the UN Charter, it's against the Anzac Treaty. Of course, no one seems to care, but you are breaking the law every time you put troops into say, in Vietnam or Iraq like that. That's a breach of the ANZUS Treaty.
We have no reason to believe we can actually operate these boats. I mean, this is a nuclear-powered submarine has a nuclear reactor in it. Australia has almost no experience of operating nuclear reactors, no experience at all of operating them in this kind of setting. And the demands on the Royal Australian Navy to try and get these things to work, well, put it this way, the risk that we don't get it right, the risk that we can't operate them effectively, and therefore that even the boats we have won't be able to get to sea, won't be able to fight effectively, is very high. So I think it's a classic example that the Navy, the government, is going for something sort of
bells and whistles.
Exactly, glitzy and glamorous and sounds great. But in terms of practically delivering real military capability, it makes no sense at all.
There is apparently no argument in the Defence Department that what we need to do is to build nuclear-powered submarines which can sail a long way for a long time, and their only rational strategic utility is helping the Americans in a war against China. We then have to think about the really serious question of how do we handle nuclear safety issues, not just at sea, and submarines have a bad history. Nuclear submarines have a bad history of sinking or burning up. We also have to think about nuclear submarines in Australian ports. You have a fire at Garden Island. Who knows? We have no nuclear safety regulatory capability. We do not have the engineering capabilities. We do not have the long-haul nuclear engineering, nuclear safety capabilities in our universities, in our defence colleges. Even if you think that's all a good idea, things go wrong. The list of nuclear accidents isn't just about 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Fukushima. There are dozens of major nuclear accidents, most of them through technological fail or human error.
Not even Peter Dutton, when he's Defence Minister, said that he expected China to try and occupy Australia. Well, that being the case, you've got to ease back a bit how they're a threat to Australia, in what sense they're a threat. And why are we building so much military equipment and trying to get nuclear submarines and that to stand off China and be involved in a war with China?
I think the whole notion of AUKUS, which is basically three Anglo nations from thousands of kilometres away, gathering around China to encircle China. I mean, the notion of the people of the United Kingdom going to war against China, how on earth is it in their interests to go to war against this big power thousands of kilometres away?
Hi guys, how are you? Hi. You just arrived here in Parliament, haven't you? What do you think of our leaders? You're proud of
very good, proud. Proud to be Australian.
What about you?
Yeah, we're proud they're representing us.
Yeah. Who are you barracking for? Labour, Liberal or United Party?
Probably Labour.
Labour, yeah? Right. What about you guys?
Same. Labour.
Labour? And?
Labour too.
Yeah. Are you happy with Mr Albanese so far, what his government's doing?
So far, so good.
Yeah.
Lockheed Martin, ladies and gentlemen, the world's largest producer of killing machines.
Australia in recent years has moved away from the great tradition we had. Australia, especially in the UN, was very strong on disarmament and working for peace. We were a big player in getting the Arms Trade Treaty up and running. In more recent times, particularly since the arms industry itself in Australia has been more privatised, there's been the influence of these big corporations coming into our political and public space. And what we now see, unfortunately, are things like goals of being the 10th largest weapons exporter in the world. We are exporting weapons into the world's violent hotspots like the Middle East. But we have been, over a long period of time, a very major customer of the US arms industry. Australia is a top 5, in fact we're currently 4th at importing arms, so we're a big customer.
The 4th largest importer of weapons in the world, Australia.
That's right.
A country with 26 million people.
Yes.
What a great record to hold up and be proud of, eh?
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
The military-industrial complex of the United States are heavily embedded in Canberra and very influential in defence planning and even in defence decision-making.
They all have access. They have passes to make them lobbyists. Yet we, as Canberra citizens, Australian citizens who've travelled here with our message, have to fill in forms. We have to pass security, and we're not allowed in anyway. And if we have a strong message, then we're doubly not allowed in. We're not allowed on the forecourt. We're only allowed in the authorised assembly area, which is the green space out the back of Parliament House. No parliamentarians see us there. They don't want this message.
The revolving door is a concept that describes movement of people out of the public sector and into the private sector, and then also people can come from private back into public. When we're talking about the defence sector, that would be something like, I'll use a well-known example to start. We've got, say, a former defence minister who would leave office and then go and work for an arms company in some way, or a lobbying firm that works for arms companies. As well as politicians, because they're the ones we mostly hear about, there's a lot of other people that you never hear about. So that would be the staff of the defence ministers, the bureaucracy in defence itself, also quite a lot of military, senior military also retire from the military and move into arms companies. And also in recent years, there's cybersecurity companies and surveillance companies and that kind of thing. So all the national security apparatus. So there's revolving doors between all those areas and the public service.
And why is that a threat to democracy?
Well, it's a problem, especially in this sector. So for starters, let me say very clearly, it's not illegal. So any of the people I may mention, they're not doing anything illegal. And also there's an argument in the business world that, you know, of course, these companies want to hire people with experience. So what's the problem? The problem is that it happens in a short period of time from when they've left office to when they go there, too short a period of time very often. The other problem with it is it's become so normalised now that people in those senior public positions, they would have in many cases, not all, would have an eye on their future career after their public life. And that can influence, whether consciously or unconsciously, the decisions they might make while in public life still. They can show favouritism towards certain companies, and even at the least, just be unwilling to rock the boat.
We won't have nuclear missiles, but we'll have missiles that could be part of an American attack on China.
Submersion ship, dive aye. Dive.
These are very complicated pieces of cyber engineering and physical engineering, and they're very costly, and they're made by a very small number of companies. We know already that the French-built submarines were to have American combat systems because we want them to be interoperable with the American Navy. They were to be built by Lockheed Martin. There are only 2 or 3 other companies in the world that could come near to producing this. Lockheed Martin is the biggest armaments company in the world. It's one of the major nuclear weapons suppliers. But we know that we have one of the problems, even in the American political system, let alone in ours, that governments have very little control over the way those companies produce defence products. And so we can expect the costs will just rise and balloon.
The federal government says it's working to get billions of dollars worth of delayed defence projects back on track. At least 28 major programs are cumulatively a century behind schedule, and 18 are over budget.
The amount of money we're spending on military equipment is just insane at the moment. There's so much overlapping and so on. It's a lot easier to work out what you need to spend on defending Australia than in trying to build a forward defence thing which is supposed to protect you. Well, so was the Singapore British Naval Base, and that didn't work out too well when the Japanese buddy took it over very soon. And these submarines are meant to be a similar form to that of being up there.
We could buy 25 really good conventionally powered submarines for the price we'll pay, we hope to pay, for 8 nuclear powered submarines. We get 3 times as many submarines, and numbers really matter. You know, the more boats you have out there, the more of the other guy's ships you're going to sink, the more damage you'll do to him. So the fact that nuclear submarines are so expensive and therefore drive down the numbers we can afford is a really big issue. Now, the government often says the first boat will be delivered sometime around 2040, but the first boat doesn't matter because one boat isn't a capability. We need, and we know this, we need 6 boats. 6 boats is the absolute minimum viable operational capability. And on the very most optimistic estimates, we won't have 6 boats until the middle of the 2050s. Now, the fact is that the strategic contest over the future of Asia will be long over by then. And we're in very grave danger of facing the most dangerous decades we've seen since the 1940s without any submarine capability at all.
From the trajectory of the development of Chinese military technology and Chinese scientific technology, that by 2040, 2050, Australian submarines planning to sail through Indonesian waters up through the Philippines and the South China Sea to the East China Sea to sit outside Shanghai are going to be facing a very different underwater surveillance balance than what exists at present. We have no idea what the strategic environment is East Asia and Southeast Asia will be like by 2040, 2050. Will those submarines even be a rational answer to any strategic problem at that time? And will they be anything other than a suicide activity for Australian sailors?
The federal government is spending between $1 and $2 billion on 2 new weapon systems, described as the cutting edge of modern military hardware.
The High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, allows militaries to shoot and scoot, but its deadly effectiveness goes beyond mere buzzwords. Ukraine credits it with helping to shift the momentum of the war. Australia will get 20 of the Lockheed Martin US-made launchers by 2026 to 2027.
One of the big problems in Australia in this sector is the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. So we had an example late last year with the new Defence Minister, Richard Marles, who had been given a report that said defence projects, procurement projects are cumulatively a century running behind schedule by a century, and $6.5 billion over budget. So he made this announcement and, in my opinion, correctly called it a systemic, serious problem, which it is.
Ministers laying the blame not on the department, but the coalition's handling.
A government that was totally focused on press releases and announcements, on hoopla and vaudeville.
But then he immediately moved away from talking about the system, and he exonerated the Defence Department and the arms industry from any blame and purely laid the blame at the feet of his political opponents.
So we're just going to remind everybody that Kim Beazley was one of the first architects of the exports, the Australian exports to the region, weapons exports, exports of violence. Beazley went on, after he was the Defence Minister, he went on to be the ambassador of the USA. And it seems that this is part of the revolving doors. If you can get an ambassadorship to the USA or the UK, you are really in a position to do the deals. That's where the executive decisions get made between the Defence Minister and the ambassador.
The revolving door is something that is a factor in both major political parties, and so, as well as high-profile examples, we can see a recent one having been Kim Beazley. He's actually moved through the revolving door a couple of times in his career. The first one was when he came back from being the US ambassador. He joined the board of Lockheed Martin, which is a US, the world's largest weapons maker by a very long way. And at the same time, he was speaking and writing for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which advises government, supposedly independently, advises government on defence and security policy. So he had those two positions going at the same time. And ASPI, this Strategic Policy Institute, didn't, the ones I saw, declare his position on the Lockheed board.
Most of the defence ministers end up in these positions. We've got Kim Beazley. We'll visit Brendan Nelson later in the day.
Yes.
Yeah, don't shade your eyes, shade your eyes.
Yeah, this is horrifying.
We've got Christopher Pyne, former minister, now part of Albert Systems, NIA, and this is the architect of the Australian Missile Corporation.
Christopher Pyne is a recent example that a lot of people would remember. As Defence Minister, he was actually talking with EY, which is a consulting firm, one of the big four in the world, and he, 9 days after leaving Parliament, took a position with them. They have a large defence practice. Having been Defence Minister in Cabinet and talking with them about it while he was still the Defence Minister. So he basically makes a mockery of the ministerial standards, which everyone recognised at the time. As well as his lobbying firm, Christopher Pyne has also now moved on to the boards of various defence-related companies. So there's one in Australia, an Australian one called NIA, N-I-O-A. It sells ammunition and it's grown quite a lot in recent years. It's now also involved in the Australian Missile Corporation and bidding for the production of missiles here. The Yemen war is little known in Australia, not very much reported. It's been going on since early 2015. I could make an analogy for you. Everyone is quite rightly upset with Russia invading Ukraine. Anyone supplying weapons to Russia is rightly condemned. There's terrible war crimes going on there. On the other side, we have the Yemen war, which has been going on since 2015. The USA has been the major supplier of weaponry into the Saudis, untold war crimes there as well. Something like 3/4 of the population is in need of aid. Children are starving to death for lack of food. It's a really terrible situation. and the US is a big arms supplier there, as well as the UK, and as I was saying, our Australian firm is also supplying the Saudis and the UAE.
On August 9th, Zaid's son Osama filmed his class on their long-awaited school trip, a reward for graduating summer school. Within hours, and it had all gone horribly wrong. A plane from the US-backed Saudi-led coalition struck a bus carrying them. Dozens died. Some of the bodies were so mutilated, identification became impossible. All that's left are the scraps of school books, warped metal, and a single backpack. Munitions experts tell CNN this was a US-made Mark Mk-82 bomb, weighing in at half a ton. The first 5 digits there are the cage number, the commercial and government entity number. This number here denotes Lockheed Martin, one of the top US defense contractors.
In recent years, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been one of the key and strongest voices in Australia with the increasing rhetoric against China and the huge threat that China apparently presents.
We need to have an army with more hitting power and more range, and that's what these weapons will give them.
Confirming an unclassified version of the Defence Strategic Review will be released before the May budget.
The government can't hide the fact that China is both an important market and the potential aggressor that every other country in the region is worried about. And I think the acid test for government is balancing those two realities.
One of the problems with ASPI is that it's part of its charter is that it's independent of government and the defence organisation. It's supposed to be independent. So when we start having 1, 2 former defence ministers sitting on the governing council, you're calling into question how independent the organisation really is, particularly when it's accepting large amounts of funding from the US government as well as the Australian government. They ought to be also independent of the influence of the arms industry, because the arms industry is so closely enmeshed in this secretive relationship with governments that they can't really be prized apart. So if an organisation such as ASPI wants to maintain the perception, which is what it says in its charter, the perception as well as the reality of its independence, it needs to take heed of that and consider that perhaps being sponsored by arms industry isn't a good idea.
How does that fit into Lockheed Martin, to Boeing, to Raytheon, to Northrop and stuff?
Well, all of those ones you've mentioned are either on the board of the Australian Policy Institute, upon which Richard Marles has said he implicitly relies for advice. There are also lobbyists for all of those armaments manufacturers who are working as either consultants or advisors to the Australian government with regard to defence procurement and force posture and so on.
Also tonight, a further escalation in the war in Ukraine. Another drone strike targeting a Russian airfield sets an oil tank ablaze.
Now is business reporter Edward Boyd.
It's profit season in the States, so there were some big companies reporting better than expected profits. The big one was the huge defence company Lockheed Martin. That is really starting to profit from all of the global conflict that's happening at the moment. So apparently their F-35 fighter sales have been strong. That's really pushed up their revenue. I think it was about $17 billion US in revenue in just a 3-month period. So their shares skyrocketed about 9% overnight.
This is what Ukraine got for Christmas. Patriot missiles represent America's most advanced ground-based air defense system. Each missile costs $4 million US. The launchers more than twice that. They require a support crew of nearly 100 soldiers who will need training. That means they're likely to be in action late and will be reserved for large-scale incoming strikes aimed at causing maximum death or damage.
Tomorrow marks 1 year since the invasion began. Ukrainian fighters with Western weapons have exploited the failures of Russia's military planners, but at a heavy cost.
The people of Ukraine are the victims. They have been caught in the middle of a war between the United States and Russia, and neither the United States nor Russia cares about the thousands and thousands of people who have died in Ukraine. But these companies are the ones that are the real winners. Their share price has gone through the roof. They are making billions at the expense of people's lives, livelihoods, and their homes. And they continue to do that. And our government allows them to operate from our soil.
Once weapons were manufactured to fight wars, now it appears that wars are manufactured to sell weapons.
Australia is hugely secretive about our exports.
Really?
So, you can't. I have tried, and so have many other journalists. You cannot get information about what companies are sending what to which country.
It's disgusting that it should be on public record.
It should be, and we're a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, which we've said will be transparent, and we're not. We do know one company, but that was because of great investigative work by the ABC, and that is Electro-Optic Systems, EOS. We do know that company is exporting its weapon systems to the United Arab Emirates. It's a huge customer for them, and also the Saudis in the time frame of the Yemen war.
Australia's leader Anthony Albanese are framing this collective spend in the billions of dollars as a new dawn for defence and security cooperation at a critical moment in world history. Amid rising tensions with the US, China's President Xi Jinping now issuing renewed warnings about his intention to dramatically boost his nation's defences.
A blunt warning from China's president addressing thousands of delegates at the close of the Communist Party's National People's Congress.
We should strengthen national defence and army modernisation, building the People's Army into a Great Wall of Steel that effectively safeguards national security, sovereignty and development interests.
Albanese and Richard Marles are desperately trying to maintain what they call the intimacy of the alliance with the United States. Basically, I think what they're saying is we can't afford to get the United States offside. But at the same time, Penny Wong is trying to stabilise the relationship with China, and Albanese is contributing to that effort as well. But there's been no cutting back or slowing down of Australia's preparations for war.
And the buck stops with me.
Nuclear submarines were top of the agenda for Defence Minister Richard Marles during a series of high-level meetings in Washington. Mr Marles says he had constructive talks with the US National Security Advisor before meeting Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon.
Yes, we do live in a world with bullies, people who want to exert undue influence over others. Again, I think we need to get away from the hypocrisy and not look at this as just those people, the enemy, doing this. I think we need to hold up a mirror and look at ourselves as well. You know, what role has the United States played in wars since the Second World War? The United States is virtually never at peace. So can the United States preach about the need for peace? And the answer to that would be no, probably they can't. Can Australia preach about the need for peace? Well, Australia has done some very, very good things, and yet when Australia goes to join every US war, practically without exception, without considering the merits of that war, without considering is this really going to help peace or is it not, then we've got a lot of thinking to do about our own role, and Australia could do a lot more to promoting a more peaceful world.
Good evening. Australia is about to embark on a 3 decades-long mission to build a sovereign nuclear-powered submarine fleet, one of the most expensive programs in the nation's history. In a joint media appearance with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the US and UK leaders have delivered public backing to share their tightly controlled nuclear capability secrets in order to make it happen. The next phase of the AUKUS Pact means Australia will buy 3 existing Virginia-class submarines from the US, pending approval from Congress, with an option to buy another 2. Australia and the UK will also work on a joint design of a new class of submarine, the next class for both countries. The cost? Up to $368 billion over the next 30 years. America's defensive scale measured in layers of military might. Sailors adorning 3 nuclear submarines and a missile destroyer, paving the way for the leaders' podium finish.
As we stand at the inflection point in history, the United States can ask for no better partners in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of our shared future will be written.
Whatever the challenges ahead, the cause of peace and freedom that we share will prevail.
3 democracies that are coming together again to fulfill that higher purpose of maintaining freedom, peace, and security.
laid on us today a duty to be prepared, to be strong, not with the strength of a bully, but with the strength of a deliverer. The world needs the United States of America. The world needs the British peoples of the world. The world needs every scrap of democratic strength. May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
While still maintaining its traditional links with Mother England, Australia firmly aligned itself with the American camp.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and form a growing menace to the future of this country. Does that disturb you? It should. Let us all face the grim facts like these Australians. United we will stand. Divided, most assuredly we shall fall.
Korea. Vietnam.
Once again, Australia sent troops to fight with the United States. Then Saigon itself was cut off. Thousands gathered at the American embassy trying to get out with the last of their departing allies, driven by rumours of what the North Vietnamese would do when they finally won. Huge bribes were offered to get aboard the departing helicopters. But there were too many people and too few planes. On the aircraft carriers offshore, helicopters worth millions of dollars were ditched to make room for more people. And then the last helicopter left.
The US is Australia's vital security ally. It's our closest global partner.
We're more effective when we stand and work together.
More of that work to be done in Australia, with confirmation of increased American military rotation.
China's dangerous and coercive actions throughout the Indo-Pacific, including around Taiwan, toward the Pacific Island countries, and in the East and South China Seas, threaten regional peace and stability.
We face a world in which the strategic environment is as complex and precarious, really, as at any point since the end of the Second World War.
What Putin's doing is dreadful, but I certainly hope there won't be the same number of casualties or deaths as have occurred in some of the wars we've been involved in, including 3 million civilians were killed in the Korean War. Terrible things happened to both civilians and soldiers in the Vietnam War, including napalm and various poisons like dioxin, etc., which still exist in the waterways. And the mothers are looking after babies with terrible, deformed big bodies and so forth, and in great pain. And
like with depleted uranium that was used in Iraq as well.
Yes, and the other thing that happens, staying with the Vietnam one thing, is the Americans made no attempt, till a belated attempt, under the last Democrat president, to give any help at all to the people who are the victims of a lot of these things, including the dioxin in particular. The Vietnam War was posed as part of forward defence for Australia. It stopped them coming down here. Well, the Vietnamese actually won that war, and they've shown no sign of coming down here, taking over Australia.
2 wars in Iraq.
It on the TV. Machine guns fired towards the ground. I watched the people run. Helicopter gunship strafing the street. I watched them lining up the bars.
All right, you're clear.
just trying to find targets.
In the Baghdad.
That's for 6. This is pushing out for 2-6.
They say these leaks had consequences, and I must agree.
Got a bunch of bodies laying there.
When I saw them fire on the children,
All right, we got about 8 individuals.
it affected me.
Hey, request permission to
20 years in Afghanistan. Oh my God, he's fallen.
It's been 20 years since a US-led coalition ousted the Taliban in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks. 41 Australians were killed on operational deployments to Afghanistan. 454 British personnel lost their lives, and almost 2,300 US troops have died. During that time, more than 120,000 Afghan military, police, and civilians have lost their lives.
Albo, when will we ever learn?
Hundreds packed inside this jet. As the strong clung to an air bridge, the increasingly distraught tried to scale airport walls.
The Prime Minister has also lashed out at the militant group after it said Australian soldiers who were killed during fighting in Afghanistan had died in vain.
It's sickening and it's untrue, but I'm not surprised about a dishonourable statement from the Taliban.
Shed no tear. Go back to those who sent you here. We are the young they drafted out to wars their folly brought about. Alba, we're being set up by the Yanks to take the bullet, to cop it from either China or Russia, just so America can remain the top dog.
Next generation submarine to be called SSN AUKUS. The biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history.
And it's an expensive exercise. The bill to taxpayers, analysts have been suggesting between $170 and $200 billion over the life of the program. But the full scale unveiled today forecast to be somewhere between $268 billion and $368 billion.
Honourable Prime Minister, look at what we have to forgo. The vital services for millions of ordinary Australians if you and Defence Minister Richard Marles opt to buy 6 to 8 nuclear-powered submarines with a price tag attached that it will inevitably blow out in their lifetime before they have to be carefully decommissioned. Still going? Oh, you're ready. You want to stick one of those pillows down the back, please? Sure, mate. Albo, we used to revere our poets, and now we can't wait to shut the book on them. But these are the sensitives. They're the ones who know what we're getting up to. So we found this poem by A.D.H. Hope, one of Australia's great poets of the last century. It's called Inscription for War and was inspired by an anonymous tombstone found at the scene of the battle in ancient Greece. vastly outnumbered by the invading Persians. We are the one they drafted out to wars their follies brought about. Go tell those old men, safe in bed, we took their orders and are now dead. Albo, contemplating going to war. Why, Albo? Why?